You to join me, give a very warm Houston welcome to Mark Movsesian.
I'd like to begin by thanking Mark Lanier and the Lanier Theological Library for inviting me here to visit with you, and to thank all of you for devoting a Saturday night to listening to me. You must really like law professors in Houston, Texas, all I have to say. This is the second occasion that I've had to visit the library, and I must say it's a remarkable place with an outstanding collection, and you're extremely fortunate to have it right here where you live. I greatly enjoyed this afternoon's panel as well. I also want to thank Dean Simons and my colleagues from St. John's and our students. We told them it would factor into the grade, but no, I'm kidding. But I want to welcome them, and I want to thank them also for coming. The title for my lecture tonight is Religious Freedom for Mideast Christians, Yesterday and Today. It's a timely and sobering topic. Mideast Christians today faced one of the worst persecutions in their long history. Let me begin by giving you two examples. Last month, perhaps 100,000 Christian refugees fled their homes in northern Iraq in response to attacks by the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, an Islamist group that has conquered about a third of that country, as well as about a third of Syria. ISIS had told these Christians that they had three choices. They could convert to Islam, they could accept the terms of the dhimma, the notional contract that governs the treatment of Christians in classical Islamic law and requires them to accept a suppressed status, about which I'll have much to say this evening, or they could depart. The Christians departed after ISIS required them to leave all their belongings behind. Earlier this spring, in the city of Raqqa, in Syria, which ISIS has made its capital, ISIS had offered Christians the same choice, the dhimma or expulsion. Most Christians chose expulsion, and you can see on the screen, I got this image from the web. This is the Armenian Catholic Church of the Martyrs in Raqqa in Syria before ISIS took over and after. Note what's happened. ISIS has taken down the cross from the top and put up the ISIS flag. Also notice the bell has been taken down. And I'm going to refer to this again later in the evening because it's a significant part of the dhimma. In Egypt, Coptic Christians have suffered greatly at the hands of a different Islamist group, the Muslim Brotherhood. For decades, the Brotherhood has been harassing Christians in Egypt. The Mubarak government did relatively little to help. When the Brotherhood gained power in the Arab Spring of 2011, after the Arab Spring of 2011, Christians felt even more threatened. When the Brotherhood fell from power last year, it had governed very badly and made itself widely unpopular. The Brotherhood blamed its fall principally on Coptic Christians. It has now targeted Christians for even more violence. The Brotherhood has murdered Christians and burned their churches and villages to the ground. Scholar Samuel Tadros of the Hudson Institute writes that today, Coptic Christians face the worst persecution in 800 years. These are only the most vivid examples. Everywhere in the region, Christians suffer discrimination in many aspects of daily life: employment, education, housing. The crisis is taking a great toll. Many Christians, like those in northern Iraq, have become refugees. It's not an exaggeration to say that Mideast Christianity, which has survived for thousands of years, since the very beginnings of the faith, today faces the threat of elimination in the very places where Christianity was born and first took root. We're witnessing one of the great human rights catastrophes in history, a genocide. Yet the outside world has done relatively little in response. Western governments and international human rights advocates have shown very little interest. Sometimes the indifference is jarring. For example, last month, the United States government dispatched helicopters to rescue 40,000 Yazdi refugees whom ISIS had surrounded on a mountain in northern Iraq. And we dropped humanitarian supplies to 15,000 Shia Turkmen in the Iraqi town of Amerli. As Americans, we should be proud of the rescue of these innocent and helpless people. But the US government has done nothing to help those 100,000 Christian refugees whom ISIS had forced into the Iraqi desert in the weeks and days before. Mideast Christians observe this difference in treatment, and they wonder why. In my talk this evening, I'd like to do three things. First, I'll give an introduction to the Christians of the Middle East. Most American Christians know little about them, and that's a pity. These are among the oldest Christian communities in the world, and they have had great accomplishments down the centuries, not the least of which has been their ability to survive and witness to the faith in very adverse circumstances. Indeed, this chapel where we meet tonight, a lovingly built reconstruction of a 6th century Byzantine church, now sadly gone, testifies to those accomplishments. It's fitting, in this magnificent building, to reflect on the people who built the original, and their descendants today, many of whom suffer greatly for their Christian faith. Second, I'll describe the persecution of Mideast Christians and situate it historically. Because it's so much in the news right now, I'll focus on ISIS and its actions in Syria and northern Iraq. In imposing the dhimma on Christians, ISIS has reverted to an old model, what we might call the traditional or classical Islamic approach to dealing with Christians in Muslim societies. This model existed in the Mideast for centuries, until it was abolished in the Western-influenced reforms of the 19th and 20th centuries. To understand what's happening in Syria and northern Iraq, and why Mideast Christians are so worried, one must understand the classical Islamic model. Although ISIS has adopted an extreme version of that model, it did not invent the dhimma on its own. What ISIS is doing has roots in Islamic tradition. Third, I'll say something about the reasons why the West, and the United States particularly, shows so little interest in the fate of Mideast Christians. Mideast Christians fail to attract attention, I think, for three reasons. A secular outlook that prevents many journalists, human rights advocates, and government officials from seeing Christians as sympathetic victims. A belief in the State Department that Mideast Christians are not a priority for American foreign policy, and a lack of knowledge and support in the general public, even among American Christians. I'll close by suggesting steps that American Christians, and all people of goodwill, can take to help these beleaguered people. There's no easy solution, but there are some things we can do. I'm going to be addressing controversial subjects tonight. I'm going to try to give you an objective view of the history and the current situation, but I know that I'm addressing emotional subjects, so I should clarify some things from the start. First, this is a vast topic, and I can't cover everything in the time that we have. I hope that my talk will serve as a helpful introduction and spur greater interest. Second, I know that factors other than Islam are involved in the persecution of Mideast Christians: diplomatic, political, economic, and social. I understand that Islam, like other world religions, has different forms. Many Muslims do not support reinstatement of the dhimma and are appalled at what is happening to Christians. Most Muslims, even very traditional or conservative Muslims, firmly reject ISIS. Finally, I know that ISIS victimizes other Muslims as well as Christians. All that being said, my claim is a modest but I think important one, and that is that classical Islam has been an important factor in the treatment of Mideast Christians throughout history and continues to play an important role today. A personal note, if I might, about the building where we meet tonight. The original church on which this chapel is based, as I say, was built in the 6th century and stood in the region of Cappadocia, in a town called Tamarza, in what is today Turkey. The church was called in Greek the Church of the Panagia, which would be translated in English as St. Mary, and I put up an old photograph from 1909, when the church was already a ruin. The Church of the Panagia was Greek, but Tamarza was an Armenian city, with Armenian churches and an Armenian monastery that was a pilgrimage site. As it happens, on my mother's side, my people are Armenians from Cappadocia, from a city called Kayseri, which is about 30 miles from Tamarza. As far as we can tell, they lived in Cappadocia for centuries. Certainly they were there 200 years ago. It's entirely possible, therefore, that my ancestors knew the original church on which this chapel was based, and indeed worshipped there. Today, sadly, the churches and monasteries are destroyed, victims of an earlier genocide in Turkey at the beginning of the 20th century. I have to say, as a personal note, it's very moving for me to be in this rebuilt chapel, which I view as a tribute to those Christians, including some of my relatives. Well, most American Christians know comparatively little about Mideast Christians. Some are surprised to learn that Mideast Christians even exist. In fact, between 12 and 16 million Christians live in the region, about 5% of the total population. In some countries, the percentage is higher. Lebanon traditionally is thought to be 50% Christian, although most observers think the percentage is smaller. In Egypt, Christians make up around 10% of the population. They're around 10% in Syria as well. Maybe 7% of Jordan is Christian. A few decades ago, about 4% of Iraqis were Christian. Now it's less than 0.5%. To give you an idea, 100 years ago, Christians made up 20% of the population of the Middle East. That figure alone suggests the struggles that Mideast Christians have undergone in the last century. A good way to get a handle on the wide variety of Christian churches in the Middle East is to look at things historically. Most of these churches are ancient, having been founded by the apostles themselves. Some continue to use a dialect of Aramaic, the language of Jesus. To know the Christian communities of the Middle East is to know the history of the faith itself. So I put up a chart on the screen which shows you a history of Christianity. You can see that things went along pretty well in the first few centuries. I'm sure some people will debate me on that, but I guess we'd say the first permanent divisions occur in the 4th and 5th centuries, around the time the original of this chapel was built in Cappadocia. And these first permanent divisions related to the great Christological controversies. The Christological controversies had to do with the nature of Jesus Christ. All Christians believe that Jesus Christ is both God and man, both human and divine. But how should we describe the relationship between Christ's humanity and his divinity? Christians disagreed about this, sometimes violently. Should we say Christ has two natures, human and divine, that are entirely separate from one another? Should we say he has one nature, in which his divinity and humanity combine? Should we say that he has two natures linked together in one person? If that's the case, what's the correct way to describe the linkage? Should we say Christ is one person in two natures, or one person from two natures? Now, these are exceptionally complicated, one might say obscure, semantic debates. Nowadays, they interest mostly church historians. But Christians at the time took them very seriously. And there were political overtones as well. Christians on the borders of the Byzantine Empire, in Egypt and Syria, for example, resented being dictated to by Constantinople. They resisted attempts to force them to agree to imperially mandated creeds. Suffice it to say that the debates broke the unity of Christianity in the East in a way from which it has never fully recovered. Indeed, the disunity of Christians was a major factor in the Muslim conquest of the 7th century. Christians had fought so bitterly among themselves for so long that they were little match for the advancing Arab armies. Nowadays, thankfully, most Mideast Christians look past these disputes and cooperate in many aspects of church and social life. It's true, the monks occasionally quarrel in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. I'm sure you've seen the videos. They come out around Easter every year. But that's a real estate dispute. There's much intermarriage across church lines, and informally, at least, intercommunion. No doubt, the severe persecution that Mideast Christians have endured down the centuries has contributed to what Pope Francis has called an ecumenism of blood. All right, so starting from the bottom of the chart, down the bottom of the chart, the first group you see is the Assyrian Church, also called the Assyrian Church of the East. This is a very small church today, located mostly in Iraq, which has been formally separated from the mainstream of Christianity since the Council of Ephesus in the 4th century. You can't see it. I was going to point it out to you. The dome of the chapel shows you what the fight was all about. So you can't see it, but I can. Up in front of me here is an icon of the Virgin Mary, and it says in Greek underneath her, Mariam Theotokos. Mariam Theotokos, which in Greek means the bearer of God, or in English it's usually translated as the mother of God. And this is how Orthodox and Catholic Christians refer to Mary up to today. The Assyrian Church objected to this, saying that Mary should only be called the bearer or the mother of Christ, not the mother of God. Other Christians thought that the Assyrians' objection meant that the Assyrians really didn't believe that Jesus is God, and so they excommunicated them. At one time, the Assyrian Church was quite large, especially in Persia. In the Middle Ages, it spread as far as China, where you can still see ruins of Assyrian churches today. Next up from the bottom are the so-called Oriental Orthodox. These are churches that teach that Christ has one combined human-divine nature. Among them are the Coptic Church in Egypt, the largest Christian church in the Middle East with as many as 15 million communicants, the Syriac Orthodox Church, which still uses a dialect of Aramaic, the language of Jesus, and whose missionaries spread Christianity as far as India, and my own Armenian Orthodox or Armenian Apostolic Church. To give you a sense of the numbers, there are maybe 800,000 Syriac Christians in the Middle East today. This is a true story. The newly elected patriarch of the Syriac Orthodox Church, installed only a few months ago in Damascus, served for many years in a parish in Teaneck, New Jersey. Once a student at St. John's told me she'd like to travel to one of those remote Syrian villages where you can still hear people speaking the language of Jesus. I told her she could just drive to Teaneck. The Armenian Apostolic Church, founded by the apostles Thaddeus and Bartholomew, was once comparatively large in the Middle East, especially in Turkey, but 1 to 2 million Armenian Christians were massacred or displaced in the genocide of 1915. There are roughly 3 million Armenian Christians in the present-day Republic of Armenia, although strictly speaking, that's perhaps outside the Middle East. Next up are the Eastern Orthodox. These are churches with a heritage in the Byzantine Empire. In the Mideast, we're speaking principally of the Greek Orthodox and the Antiochian Orthodox churches. The Greek Orthodox Church is well known in the US, of course, and the Antiochian Orthodox, headquartered in Damascus, have done large-scale evangelization in the US in recent decades and drawn many converts. Unlike the Oriental Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox accept the doctrinal definitions of the Council of Chalcedon, which was in 451, which declare that Christ has two separate natures, human and divine, linked together in one person. Western Christianity, including both Roman Catholics and Protestants, accept Chalcedon as well. Most Mideast Christians belong to one of these two families, the Oriental Orthodox or the Eastern Orthodox. But other Christians are in the region as well. Moving up the chart, there's the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox divided in the year 1054. The dispute was mostly about the authority of the Pope. The Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox, for that matter, do not accept that the Pope has universal jurisdiction in the Church or that he is infallible. But there were other theological disagreements as well, including disputes about the Immaculate Conception and the famous Filioque clause in the Nicene Creed. Most Mideast Catholics belong to Eastern Rite churches. That is, they do not use the Latin Rite that Catholic churches use in the West. And most of them were founded around the time of the Crusades. The largest Catholic community in the Middle East is the Maronite Church in Lebanon, with about 1 million people. Finally, there are Protestants and evangelicals, members of churches founded principally by missionaries, many of them Americans in the 19th century. And Jim Hoffmeyer today on the panel told me that his parents were missionaries in Egypt. Historically speaking, Protestants and evangelicals are new arrivals in the Middle East, and their numbers are pretty small. But they've had an outsized influence, largely because of charitable works like schools and hospitals and orphanages. Well, that's just a quick overview. I hope it gives a sense of the great variety of Mideast Christianity. Today, all Christians, Assyrians, Oriental Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Catholics, Protestants, and evangelicals, all of them, suffer great persecution. Because it's so much in the news right now, I'll focus on the activities of ISIS in Syria and northern Iraq. ISIS is a Sunni Islamist group. More specifically, it's a Salafist group. Its goal is to reinstate what it believes to be the practices of the first generations of Muslims, or the Salafs. It rejects later developments in the religion as un-Islamic. Within the past year, ISIS has managed to conquer about a third of Syria and Iraq. It controls an area with a population of about 4 million people. It's neither a fringe nor a trivial phenomenon. Now, here it's perhaps necessary to make an observation. When people in the West think about Islam, they often make one of two mistakes. The first is to say that Islamists like ISIS represent real, quote, or authentic, quote, Islam, as though nothing else exists. That is untrue and unfair to the vast majority of Muslims in the world, even traditional Muslims who reject groups like ISIS. As I've said, ISIS persecutes other Muslims as well as Christians. The second mistake is the opposite, to say that Islamist groups like ISIS have nothing at all to do with Islam. That's also untrue. ISIS is an extremist group, but its program for Christians is not something it made up on its own. Its conduct towards Christians is not without precedent in historical Islam. ISIS seeks to reestablish the caliphate, the classical Islamic state that existed for centuries in the Middle East. To understand ISIS's program, therefore, including its program with respect to Christians, one has to know something about the classical Islamic state, which ruled more or less from the time of the Muslim conquest in the 7th century to the Western-influenced reforms of the 19th and 20th centuries. Many people in the West think that the classical Islamic state is a theocracy, but that is not strictly speaking true. In classical Islam, the clergy do not rule. Nonetheless, the state has a very clear religious foundation. In classical thought, the Muslim community, or the Ummah, is both a spiritual and a political entity. It is the body of believers that lives, but also governs by Allah's law. The Ummah's supreme leader, or the Caliph, has ultimate responsibility for ensuring that Allah's law is enforced. Scholars have written volumes about classical Islam and government, and I lack time to do these subjects justice. One aspect is especially relevant for us, however, and that is the place of non-Muslims, and particularly Christians, in the Islamic State. Classical Islam distinguished between pagans, who had no right of permanent residence, and the so-called people of the book. The Arabic word is al-kitab. And these are groups like Christians and Jews who had been the recipients of earlier, although from the Muslim perspective incomplete, revelation. As people of the book, Christians could establish permanent residence in Muslim society. Specifically, they could make a notional contract or agreement or treaty with the Ummah. The contract was called the Dhimma. The people of the book subject to the Dhimma were called dhimmis. And the Dhimma granted Christians protection in return for a promise to accept social and legal subordination. Okay, the Dhimma's evolution is a matter of some mystery. It may derive from a verse in the Quran that commands Muslims to fight the people of the book until they pay a tribute or a tax called the jizya and accept a humbled status. So there's a Quranic verse about this. Some people think it goes back to that. Some people point to the so-called Pact of Umar, which is a probably fictional agreement between an early caliph and the Christians of Syria. Perhaps Muslims adapted existing Persian and Byzantine customs. Whatever the history, the Dhimma's terms were settled by the 8th and 9th centuries. Dhimmis were granted certain rights. They had the rights to protection, that is, protection from the state, property, they could own property. They had rights to worship. and they had rights to some communal autonomy. For example, I'm sure some of you know, they had their own court systems, and they had their own law, which would apply to disputes within the community. So if a Christian is suing another Christian, you would go to the Christian court. If a Christian is in a dispute with a Muslim, you go to the Sharia court. But if it's within the community, you go to the communal court. So those were the rights that dhimmis had. In return, dhimmis also had some obligations. First, they agreed to pay the jizya. In fact, ISIS in Syria and Iraq has reinstated the jizya. I think they're asking $500 a person twice a year or something like this, which may not sound like much, but in context of Iraq, it's actually a fairly significant sum. But anyway, the dhimmis had to pay the jizya, and they had to agree to abide by certain social and legal restrictions. For example, dhimmis had to wear identifying clothing at all times. They could not serve in the military or hold high office. They could not bear arms. They could not attract attention during worship, and they could not build new churches. Remember I pointed out the bell came off, the church in Raqqa. I said the ISIS took it down. So one of the rules of the dhimma is no bells, no church bells. In fact, some of you have been to the Holy Land, I guess, and if you've been there, you've seen some of the old churches have wooden clappers outside the door, where to call people to worship, someone comes out and bangs the wooden clapper. That's because church bells were prohibited by the dhimma. And I think Christians have, in the way many people do, they've adopted this custom as a kind of mark of pride, right? We're doing this for our faith. But it was from the dhimma. That was the origin of that. Christians could not attempt to convert Muslims, and of course conversion from Islam is a capital offense anyway, nor could they attempt to persuade other Christians not to convert to Islam. In general, dhimmis had to adopt an attitude of quiescence and submission. Humiliation, from the classical Islamic perspective, humiliation was the price for the dhimmis' stubborn refusal to see the truth and accept Islam. In fact, the harshness of the restrictions served to create, from the Muslim perspective, a salutary incentive for the dhimmis to convert, which many did over the course of centuries. Last thing about a contract is breach. Dhimmis could breach the agreement and thereby forfeit protection and other rights by disregarding the restrictions and this is especially important, and affecting equality with Muslims. Remember, the idea is you're tolerated and protected as long as you accept a subordinate status. If you assert equality in some way, that's a violation of the contract. So, conspicuous displays of wealth could be perceived as an insult. Violent retribution and plunder could follow. Persecution could also occur during periods of political and economic crisis, or if dhimmis seem to be cooperating with outsiders. And please keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to this later. If dhimmis seem to be cooperating with outsiders, with the enemies of the ummah, then the dhimmis had broken the arrangement and were subject to punishment. Now, all this being said, life for the dhimmis did not involve constant strife. Some scholars argue, although personally I think this view overstates things, some scholars argue that the treatment of dhimmis compared favorably to the treatment of religious minorities in Europe. The restrictions were not always enforced. Muslims and Christians often lived in the same neighborhoods and joined the same professional guilds. Individual dhimmis could accumulate wealth and rise in Muslim society. So for long periods of time, everything could be peaceful. A sense of insecurity and inferiority always existed, however, even in the best of times. Indeed, insecurity and inferiority were the essence of the arrangement. Such was the situation for centuries in the Mideast, until Western influence led to the rise of secular nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Under pressure from Europe, the Ottomans abolished the dhimma in the 1850s. Elsewhere, Western colonial powers introduced the concept of equal citizenship under law. And Muslim countries have continued to endorse this concept, at least formally, after decolonization. Old cultural patterns did not simply disappear, however. Abolition of the dhimma in Turkey led to a violent anti-Christian backlash, and in many countries, Christians continued to face social discrimination and even occasional persecution. But as a formal matter, the Dhimma disappeared in favor of a new Western-influenced constitutional model. Until this spring, it was unthinkable that the Dhimma could ever be revived. Well, now ISIS has revived the Dhimma and has done so in a wide territory containing millions of people in the heart of the Middle East. An important psychological line has been crossed. You can see why Mideast Christians find this so worrisome and why so many of them have attempted to escape, as as Charles said in his prayer earlier, leaving everything behind. For the moment, ISIS is unique among Islamist groups in advocating a formal reinstatement of the Dhimma. Although Islamists everywhere reject the idea of legal equality for Christians, they typically avoid calling for the Dhimma, as they understand that most contemporary Muslims would reject this idea. Nothing succeeds like success, however. ISIS has now shown that it is possible to reestablish the Dhimma at the historic center of the Muslim world. Other Islamist groups, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan, will no doubt take notice. Well, what have I done so far? I've offered an introduction to Mideast Christianity, and I've explored an example of the persecution that Mideast Christians currently suffer. Now I'd like to move to my third point, the silence of the West. Notwithstanding the truly dire situation that Mideast Christians face, most Western governments and human rights organizations have done relatively little in response. It's not that they ignore Christians entirely. Rather, it's that Christians so often seem an afterthought, a secondary concern. The examples I gave earlier, I think, are indicative. When ISIS had them surrounded on a mountainside, the US mobilized support for 40,000 Yazidi refugees, dispatching helicopters to rescue them. By contrast, when ISIS drove 100,000 Christian refugees from their homes in the weeks before, the US did nothing more than issue a verbal condemnation through its UN ambassador. Given the severity of the situation Christians face, this relative lack of attention is puzzling. In my view, 3 reasons explain why the West, and particularly the US, tends to ignore the plight of Mideast Christians. First, Western media and human rights advocates, whom one would expect to take the lead in publicizing the story, have difficulty seeing Christians as sympathetic victims. As John Allen writes of his fellow journalists, quoting, "Most Americans and Europeans are in the habit of thinking about Christianity as a rich, powerful, socially dominant institution, which makes it hard to grasp that Christians can actually be the victims of persecution. Western journalists and human rights advocates typically have a very secular worldview and are accustomed to thinking of Christians as their ideological opponents. Such a mindset makes it difficult for them to accept that Christians can have legitimate claims to religious freedom." Now, please understand, I don't claim that a conspiracy exists to minimize the plight of Mideast Christians. My point, rather, is that a secular worldview prevents many journalists and human rights advocates, and indeed government officials, from correctly assessing and internalizing the dire threats that Mideast Christians face. Second, our foreign policy apparatus tends to discount Mideast Christians. In part, this is because most State Department staff share the secular outlook that I just described. As someone has said, I think very pithily, our foreign policy elites just don't get religion. In addition, Mideast Christians are a small group that cannot do much to affect American interests. Diplomats tend to discount such groups. Finally, the State Department may wish to avoid singling out Christians for assistance so as not to be seen as playing favorites. Given the US wish to avoid anything that would even remotely justify claims of a new crusade, this attitude is perhaps understandable. This seems to be the attitude of the present administration, for example, but it's not an entirely new thing. Nina Shea of the Hudson Institute has recounted her attempts to get the previous administration to focus on the plight of Iraq's Christians, only to be told by Condoleezza Rice that directing assistance to Christians would make the United States appear sectarian. Finally, Mideast Christians lack a natural constituency in American politics. They are, as one commentator observed, too foreign to excite the right and too Christian to excite the left. Even American Christians, whom you might expect to champion the cause of Mideast Christians, show a puzzling silence. In part, this results from unfamiliarity. As I said, many American Christians are surprised to learn that there are sizable Christian communities in the Middle East. And candidly, Mideast Christians are culturally and politically different from Americans. They are Middle Eastern, and they belong to churches of which most American Christians have never heard. That's why events like tonight, which seek to make Mideast Christians more familiar, are so important, and I want to again thank Mark and the Lanier Library for hosting it. But something more than unfamiliarity is at work. Some American Christians think it's improper to advocate helping Christians, as Christians, in public life. I've encountered this attitude when I write about Mideast Christians on the First Things website. People sometimes respond in the comments that it's not appropriate for Christians to single out the plight of our co-religionists. Christians should show equal concern for everyone, they say, Christian and non-Christian alike. One commentator objected to one of my posts, "We are not supposed to help people because they are Christian. We're supposed to help people because we are Christian." Well, I understand this criticism to a point, but with respect, it seems misguided. I'm not a theologian, but I don't think Christianity requires its adherents to refrain from speaking out against injustice simply because the victims are other Christians. Of course, Christians should show compassion for non-Christians. No one said anything different. It was entirely proper for the United States to assist the Yazidis on Mount Sinjar, and as a Christian, I'm proud we did. But the fact is, in the Middle East and around the world, Christians are often the special targets of persecution, and the people who normally object to such things seem not to notice. Seeking help for Mideast Christians is not a form of inappropriate special pleading. It's a way to assure that their plight is not ignored. In fact, submerging the cause of Mideast Christians in a more generic cause for world peace minimizes the suffering that they endure. Well, assuming it is appropriate for Christians and for people of all goodwill generally to advocate on behalf of Mideast Christians, what policies should we promote? There's no simple solution. The preferred solution of many Mideast Christians is the establishment of a safe haven, protected by the international community where Christians can continue to live in the Middle East. I think this is a very worthwhile goal. I wonder who will enforce it. With respect to ISIS, the group now controls a third of Syria and Iraq. The US, as we all know, has begun airstrikes in an effort to shore up Iraqi armed resistance. Maybe that will work, but most experts believe it will be difficult to dislodge ISIS now without significant and sustained military action by the United States. There are recent precedents for such large-scale humanitarian military interventions, but an America fatigued by more than a decade of war in the Middle East will not likely commit to a new one in Iraq today. An aggressive intervention from the outside can backfire. Recall what I said a while ago about Christians becoming targets when the Ummah believes they are cooperating with the outside enemy. Discretion in words and in deeds is required. We should not raise expectations unless we are prepared to follow through and stick it out for the long haul, for decades at least, probably many decades. However well-intended, the American intervention in Iraq has contributed to a disaster for that country's Christians. From the perspective of Iraq's Christians, by overthrowing Saddam, the US helped to create a situation in which they were exposed to Islamists like ISIS and then abandoned them abruptly to their fate. Whatever we do, we must be careful to avoid steps that inadvertently make the lives of Mideast Christians more difficult than they already are. Still, there are some things we can do, and I would like to suggest a few. The first one is help church organizations and NGOs. There are a number of church organizations, many Orthodox charities, the Catholic Near East Welfare Association, Aid to the Church in Need. I'm sure that if you go on the web and look up your particular denomination and see what it's doing, I'm sure it's doing something, and if it's not, you should say something about it and tell them they should be doing something. But one thing to do is to help out the church organizations and NGOs which are trying very hard to help these people in the Middle East. Second, I'll suggest a few more, and here I have to say I'm drawing on an open letter from May of this year called A Pledge of Solidarity and a Call to Action, which was released jointly by Republican Congressman Frank Wolf of Virginia and Democratic Congresswoman Anna Eshoo of California. The letter was signed by more than 200 Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox leaders in the US. It's available on the web. First, we can insist that our government take into account the consequences of its Mideast policy for Christians at both the planning and the execution stage. A good, very recent first step is the creation of a new position at the State Department, the Special Envoy to promote religious freedom of religious minorities in the Near East and Central Asia. A special envoy with the ear of the president can help ensure that the interests of Mideast Christians and other religious minorities are considered in any negotiations over the future of Syria and Iraq. In addition, a special envoy with the confidence of the president can help rally the international community, which in the long run must take the lead in coordinating assistance for the Mideast Christians. We can insist that we can insist that Christians have fair and equal access to American humanitarian assistance. And this, it's sad to say, has not always been the case. So I'm going to quote the open letter again. Here's what it says. The US government must ensure that religious minorities are not discriminated against by local authorities in the distribution of aid donated by the US government, as was reported to have occurred at certain junctures in Iraq, contributing to the wholesale exodus of its Christians and other small religious communities. And the letter says, the US must also continue to reach Christians who avoid UN refugee camps that they perceive to be controlled by the extremist groups. And apparently this was a problem. Some of the extremist groups infiltrated the refugee camps and started taking the aid, and it was very sad. So we can insist that doesn't happen. We can insist that the US facilitate asylum claims for Mideast Christians. France has already done so. The United States has not. To me, this option seems perhaps the best one, given geopolitical realities. But I must tell you candidly that many Mideast Christians politely but very firmly reject this approach, because they say it will give Islamist groups like ISIS what they want, right, which is the elimination of Christians in the Middle East. Christian emigration is not the answer, these people say. Mideast Christians do not want to leave their home countries, where they and their ancestors have lived for thousands of years. Still, in some circumstances, and for some people, I think exit may be the only viable option. And in my view, although I understand many Mideast Christians resist this for the reasons I've stated, in my view, the US should facilitate asylum claims and make clear to Mideast Christians that they will always be welcome here among us. Finally, the last thing we can do as Christians is pray. To the world, this is a foolish thing. What can prayer hope to accomplish? But the Bible tells Christians to pray for one another. And we know, as St. Paul writes, that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. So we should pray for our brothers and sisters in the Middle East, that the hearts of the oppressors will soften, that the scourge of this most recent persecution will quickly pass away, and that Christians can live in peace among their neighbors in a way that is worthy of their calling. In fact, as we meet tonight in a chapel, I think it would be appropriate to close with a prayer. It's a well-known prayer in the Orthodox tradition, the prayer of St. John Chrysostom, said in benediction at the close of the Orthodox liturgy. John Chrysostom, the name in Greek means golden mouth, was an important early church father and a Mideast Christian. He was born in Syria around the year 350. Trained as a lawyer, he found practice uncongenial and became a monk, and then a priest, and then a bishop, and eventually the Archbishop of Constantinople, the imperial city. In time, he ran afoul of the emperor, who banished him to Armenia. We Armenians are very proud of this. He was banished to Armenia. He died in exile in the year 407. His last words in Greek were "Doxa to Theo panton eneken," glory be to God for all things. For thousands of years, the prayer I'm about to recite has been said every Sunday by countless numbers of Christians, a cloud of witnesses. It was prayed by the people who built the original of this church 1,500 years ago in Byzantium. It was prayed by my ancestors in Cappadocia, and it continues to be prayed today by the suffering but still hopeful Christians of the Middle East. Lord, bless those who praise you and sanctify those who trust in you. Save your people and bless your inheritance. Protect the whole body of your church. Sanctify those who love the beauty of your house. Glorify them in return by your divine power, and do not forsake us who hope in you. Grant peace to your world, to your churches, to the clergy, to those in public service, to the armed forces, and to all your people. For every good and perfect gift is from above, coming from you, the Father of light. To you we give glory, thanksgiving, and honor, to the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, now and always, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Thank you. If you're interested in this topic, so I put up on the screen the website of the Center for Law and Religion, which I direct at St. John's. That's our Twitter feed. So we do write a lot about this. So if you're interested, please check it out.
If the caliph can levy a tax, would this arrangement not be considered a theocracy? Would the caliph be part of the government?
Okay, so the caliph was the supreme leader of the government. But theocracy, at least as I use theocracy, is a government in which the clergy rule. And in Islam, they were very careful about saying the clergy did not directly rule. The caliph was not an imam. He was not the clergy. The clergy always stayed somewhat separate. Now you might think, well, that sounds like separation of church and state. Not really, because these were considered dual offices in the same state. It's just that the clergy did not rule directly. The one exception to this that I know of is Iran, actually, where the clergy nowadays do rule, right? The supreme leader of Iran is an imam. But that is unusual in classical Islam. The clergy would not take a direct governing role. That's all I meant by saying that it's not a theocracy.
By the way, if you liked this presentation, which I thought was just built so lawyerly, you'll see why he was Law Professor of the Year at St. John's, and it'll make you want to enroll in law school. Next comment, which Dean Simons is over here, and he says, if you can pay the tuition, he'll get you in. All right, this is a comment as well as a question, but I'll read it. You may agree, you may disagree. I'd like your response, I guess. Notwithstanding Bashar Assad's ties to Iran and Hezbollah and Russia's for his protection, the Assad family has been very protective of Christians. Why has the U.S. government, both parties and the media, been so hateful of Assad? On the other hand, Turkey has been a horrible ally, has been used by ISIS as a conduit for recruits. Turkey still requires Armenian Christians to assume Turkish names. Your thoughts?
So it's a good comment. I would say first with respect to Assad, look, so Bashar Assad is not a nice man. You would not want him to be the government necessarily if you're comparing him with James Madison, right? But if you're comparing him with ISIS, he doesn't look so bad. And this is why, seriously, this is why so when the Syrian civil war began a few years ago, many people in the Western media were thinking Assad's gone, right? In fact, I think the president said he's gone, right? Or he's finished. And at the time, I thought what people don't understand is Assad has supporters in Syria. The Christians in Syria support Assad, not because he is wonderful, but because you have a certain amount of peace under Assad, and he allowed the Christians to thrive. I was in the panel this morning, I'll tell the story. I quoted Sam Tadros. Sam Tadros is a scholar at the Hudson Institute writing about Egypt. And he was writing in his book, and he said, the thing is that with a secular dictator, you can always cut a deal of some kind. You can negotiate something. There's some way out, because you can buy him off, or you can buy off whatever. With the Islamists, you really can't negotiate. There's not a very easy way to negotiate your way out of this. So the first answer is, I sort of agree with the comment. I think we should not have been so quick to push for Bashar Assad to leave. Turkey, look, it is true that in Turkey, Christians have a hard time. There are not many Christians left in Turkey because many of them were deported or massacred 100 years ago. But the ones who are there, I'll just give you a story about this. On our blog, I wrote about this. So about a year ago, a Christian family went into the Turkish government for something or other, a Turkish government office. I think they were trying to get the kid registered for school, for a Christian school. And the functionary came back and said, sorry, you can't register, you don't have the special code. And they said, what are you talking about? What special code? He said, no, the special code is not on your documents. They didn't know anything about this, and so they started pressing, and there was some hemming and hawing, and the newspapers got involved. Apparently, there are secret identity codes in Turkey to mark you out if you're Jewish or Christian, Greek, Armenian. It's a secret code in the government records, and the Turkish government story is, well, that's just to protect you, right? That's to make sure that you can get into a Christian school and no one can sneak in who's not a Christian. Nobody believes that, really. So things are bad there. I guess I would say I agree somewhat with the tenor of that comment.
Okay. Next, and there are a couple of similar questions to this, so I'm going to kind of group them. And we've gotten more questions of you than anybody that we've had speak in a long time, so I'll try to make through as many as we can. Are the Mideast Christians fighting back with armed force? Are they capable of fighting back? Similar question. Why don't or haven't Christians in the Middle East formed security groups to defend themselves?
First of all, some Christians, I think, are arming now. I just read this morning in the Daily Telegraph online, Daily is from London, Daily Telegraph, that apparently the Lebanese Christians are beginning to arm again. The Lebanese Christians, of course, there was a civil war in Lebanon in the 1970s between Christians and Muslims, and so I guess they are now arming again. The other thing I'd say is, look, Christians are a very, very small minority, and if they really started fighting, maybe they could prevail a little bit. It's hard to see how they could prevail in the long run, and many of them may be thinking, if we start this, it's going to go. I think it's difficult maybe for an American audience to understand the psychology of living in this society where you're greatly outnumbered, and you don't have a lot of people who are going to come and help you if you get into trouble. And you try to avoid it if you can. We think we shouldn't be so hard to judge these people for not picking up arms and defending themselves. It's not at all plain how successful that would be.
Why is moderate Islam, the majority, silent in the face of the persecution of Christians?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So they're not entirely silent. I mean, there have been voices. The famous professor at Al-Azhar, which is a famous Islamic school of learning in Egypt, issued a statement saying ISIS is not the caliphate, don't believe them. I think the Saudis have said similar things. They have said things like that. So it's not they've been entirely silent. They have said things. Why they haven't done more things, that's a very good question, why they haven't done more things. Maybe they're intimidated. Maybe they're waiting for us to do it. I don't know, but there has been, it would be wrong to say that there's been no one talking out about this, because some Muslims have been.
Is there a risk of ISIS moving into other Muslim-ruled areas, such as Indonesia?
I don't think ISIS has the capability right now to get to Indonesia. Indonesia is quite far away. But recall what I said, that there are other indigenous Islamist groups in those countries. There is the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which really never said we're going to bring back the Dhimma. As I said, this is a big psychological line that has been crossed when you say we're bringing back the Dhimma. But they're looking at this. Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan, another Islamist group, they're looking at it. I'm leaving one out. Boko Haram in Nigeria, I think I just read they've declared a caliphate now. So I think the more serious danger is other Islamist groups will say, hey, wait a minute, look at that. They're in the heart of the Middle East. They're in the heart of the historic land of Islam, and they have reinstated the Dhimma, and they're succeeding. We should do that. That's, I think, more likely.
With the Ummah being a global concept.
Sorry, say again?
With the Ummah being a global concept, not restricted by territorial boundaries, can you talk about the Ummah in the USA and what prevents radical Muslims from incubating an environment conducive to the growth of groups like ISIS or the Muslim Brotherhood, etc.?
Yeah. So I think first I would say we should be careful about assuming that our fellow Muslim citizens support ISIS. They don't, right? There's not a big movement for ISIS among Muslims in America. So I don't think we should expect that. And I think so far in America, because of our great love of religious freedom, we have been able to assimilate many different groups. And so far, we seem to be doing a reasonably good job with our fellow citizens who are Muslim. That doesn't mean that I'm being naive. Of course, it's possible to have ISIS terrorism. I mean, we could wake up tomorrow and find there's been some attack. That could certainly happen. But I don't think it's at the level, for example, in Europe, I think they have more of a problem. They have more of a worry about this kind of thing. We in America, doesn't seem it's a large-scale thing to me.
Christians in Morocco seem to be safer. Why is Islam in that country gentler on Christians?
I don't know. I'm not that familiar with that setting. I mean, I would say I have a friend who works at something called the Alliance Defending Freedom. Some of you may know this group. It's a litigating group, a nonprofit group. His name is Piero Tozzi, and they're in Arizona now, I think. I think they're in Arizona. They were at one point in New York. Anyway, Piero was litigating on behalf of a Christian group in Morocco. It was running an orphanage, and they were being pushed out of the country by the government. And he was, defending them, and they were being pushed out clearly because they were Christian. So I'm not sure I would stipulate to the, as we say, I'm not sure that I would agree with the assumption that things are, I'm sure they're better. I don't hear stories about large persecution, but I'm not sure I would agree with the premise.
You said the world has witnessed other surges in Islamic violence. What has set off this most recent surge?
Yeah. So Bernard Lewis, of whom some of you may have heard, he's a famous historian of the Islamic world, and he says that if you look in Islamic history, there are long periods of calm, punctuated by moments like this one, which tend to come up when Islam feels threatened in some way, when it looks like Islam is not coming through for its people, when it looks like outsiders are ganging up. This comes back up. And so maybe you would say, well, since the 1940s, life in the Middle East has not been great. They've seen a lot of other technological changes, other civilizations surpassing them. Maybe that's why. But I guess I would say this could be another one of those periods in which the Islamic world feels threatened, or that we need to get back to basics. We need to get back to basics. And for some people, getting back to basics is going back to the first centuries, and the first centuries means reinstating the Dhimma.
What do you say for those who believe, evidently may or may not be the person writing the note, but there's a group of people who believe the U.S. government is supporting extremist Islams in the Middle East?
I've never heard that. I mean, the most I've heard is that at one point Bashar al-Assad was quietly allowing ISIS to succeed because that meant he didn't have to fight in that region in Syria. But I've not heard anything about the U.S. supporting extremist Muslims. Well, may I say one thing? Maybe he's referring to the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, when the Muslim Brotherhood won the election in Egypt, the U.S. policy did seem to be, well, this is a democratic election, we've got to let them rule. And when the coup pulled them down from power a year later, again, the U.S. was somewhat displeased about that. But that, I think, was not about supporting extremism. That was about, well, this was a democratic election, and you've got to abide by the results.
Right. Moderate Muslims seem to be pawns of their radical religious brothers. Is there really a moderate Muslim faith that stands alone, a righteous faith, or are they the buffer between radical Islam and the world by design from the beginning?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, I guess I would answer it by saying, look, as I said, in my view, if you want to understand this, you have to avoid making two different mistakes. One mistake is to say Islam has nothing to do, ISIS has nothing to do with Islam, it's totally different, nothing to do with, that's wrong. The other is to say ISIS is the real reality and everything else is kind of, phony. And I don't think that's true either. I mean, there are certainly, most Muslims in the world do not support ISIS, and I think we need to remember that.
Would you join me again in thanking Mark?
Thank you.